the purposes of this particular clause.
I hung back in the hope that the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead would speak before me, because I suspected that his remarks would help elucidate my own amendments, as indeed I believe they have. I have a large number of amendments in this group, but all of them, with one exception, work together as effectively a single amendment. They are numbers 101, 102, 109, 112, 116, 121, 191 and 220. The exception is Amendment 294, to which the noble Baroness Lady Fox of Buckley has already alluded, and to which I shall return in a moment. But if I could take that larger group of amendments first, I can describe their effect relatively briefly. There is, my lords, in the bill as it stands, there are requirements on services to consider how their practices affect freedom of expression, but there is no equivalent explicit duty within the bill on the regulator, Ofcom, to have regard for freedom of expression. These amendments, taken together, would require Ofcom to have special regard to freedom of expression within the law when designing codes of practice, writing guidance and undertaking enforcement action. They would insert a new clause requiring Ofcom to have special regard to rights to freedom of expression within the law in preparing a code of practice. They would, when submitting a draft code to the Secretary of State, also require Ofcom to submit a statement setting out how they have complied with the duty imposed by that new requirement. And they would also require the Secretary of State to submit that statement to Parliament when laying a draft code before Parliament. And they would impose similar obligations on Ofcom and the Secretary of State when making amendments to codes that might be made later on. Finally, they would also have a similar effect relating to guidance issued by Ofcom. Now, I think it is so glaringly obvious that Ofcom should be under this duty that it's a mere omission that the balancing corresponding duty has not been placed on it, that has been placed on the providers, that I would hope, though experience so far in committee doesn't lead me to expect, that my noble friend the Minister would accept this and that it would pass relatively uncontroversially. So I'll say no more about it, except to make one slightly more reflective comment, which is, and here I'm very conscious of speaking in the presence of the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead, who's perfectly entitled to correct me if I stray. But there's been a great deal of comment from the front bench and from other parts of the House about how the bill has to balance freedom of expression with safety. And inevitably there is such a balance required. But in any such balance, the scales have to be tipped in favour of freedom of expression. And that is because freedom of expression is a human right in the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, it's true, of course, that the second part of Article 10 allows it to be mitigated in some ways. But the starting point has to be the first clause of Article 10, and that is that freedom of expression stands as a fundamental human right. And every abridgment of it has to be justified individually in relation to the second part. It isn't enough to say that the two are somehow equal and we have to find a balance that is purely prudential or fits in with our notions of common sense or good judgment. There is a weighting in that balance, and that weighting is in favour of freedom of expression. So I would strongly encourage noble lords to bear that in mind, and I hope that this relatively simple proposal would find widespread acceptance. I come now to clause Amendment 294, which, as I say, is completely different. but it relates to this question of the definition of harm. Harm is defined, as the noble Baroness Lady Fox of Buckley has said, harm is defined very loosely and very vaguely in the bill. It's defined simply as physical or psychological harm, which is a sort of self-referential definition and expands it somewhat. I think we all understand what might be meant by physical harm. But when it comes to psychological harm, I could understand a definition which had a basis in medical science. Perhaps the right word for such a definition would be psychiatric harm. I could understand that because medical science has some sort of objective basis to it. But when one finds the word psychological harm being used, and when the department confirms that there is no objective basis for it, then one really is effectively opening the door to talking about feelings. Now, I know, of course, that there are genuine and real psychological harms which give great concern to members of this House, including myself. Feelings of psychological harms that lead to eating disorders are a good example of that. I understand that. I'm not trying to trivialize psychological harms, and removing the word in this amendment, of course, is a probing amendment. It's trying to find out what the government means, what boundaries, if any, it sets to its understanding of the term psychological. Because if there are no boundaries, then it really does extend to feelings, because that is how the term is increasingly used, especially amongst the young. And I really do think that is a very, very loose definition. So in probing the government on what it means by psychological harm, I hope to have something really hard and solid coming back from them that we know sets some limits to where this can actually take us.